Give it another minute. Only 4:30. That clock yet. Do we have Commissioner Karas on the phone or on the line? Perfect. And Williams? Perfect. We'll call the meeting to order. First on the agenda, we have the approval of the minutes.
I move to approve the minutes from February 27th.
Second that.
Been moved and seconded. Are there any discussions? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carries. I'll abstain. Okay. Next on the agenda, are there any public comments or items that we are not discussing today or tonight? Is there any comments from the public? Anybody online? All right. We'll move into the public hearing.
All right. Thank you, commissioners. For the record, Nicole Mardell, Senior Planner with Deschutes County Community Development. I'm going to get my PowerPoint loaded up here. But in the meantime, just wanted to note this is a public hearing related to temporary hardship dwelling text amendments, file number 247-2578-TA. Wanted to clarify, there was a question, I believe, from one of the commissioners about an article from KTVZ in which it said that the Planning Commission is proposing these amendments. That was, of course, an error. This is being proposed by Deschutes County Community Development. The Planning Commission is the first review body. So in every legislative process, there are two sets of hearings, the first before the Planning Commission, who then issues a recommendation for the Board of County Commissioners, who will hold the second hearing process. So just wanted to note that for the record. With that, I wanted to note the project website and full record is found at bit.ly/25-78-TA. And I will go ahead and open up the hearing through the hearing script. This is the time and place set for hearing on file number 247-25-78-TA concerning amendments to temporary hardship dwelling requirements in the Deschutes County Code. Staff will outline the hearing procedures that will be followed. The Planning Commission will hear oral testimony, receive written testimony, and consider the testimony submitted at this hearing. The hearing is also being recorded. The Commission may make a decision on this matter today, continue the public hearing to a date certain, or leave the written record open for a specified period of time. The hearing will be conducted in the following order. Staff representing Deschutes County as the applicant will give a brief report on the issue. We will then take testimony from agencies and any interested persons. And following testimony, the Commission can request staff to answer any additional questions. This is a hybrid public hearing with both in-person and remote participation options. For our in-person participants, if you wish to testify, please fill out a blue sign-up sheet at the side of the room there and submit it to staff. After your name is called, please come up to one of the tables at the front of the room before beginning your testimony. And before beginning your testimony, please provide your first and last name as well as your mailing address so we can provide you further notices on the proposed issue. For our remote participants, if you want to testify, you must be logged into Zoom or have called in using the Zoom dial-in option. When the chair asks if anyone would like to testify, you will need to use the raise hand feature to notify the Commission. To do this, you'll need to press the raise hand button, often found on the under the reactions tab on your computer or smart device, or if you're called in, dial *9. In addition to oral testimony, if anyone has written testimony to submit, please hand that to me. Or if you're participating remotely, you can submit that to my email, nicole.mardell@deschutes.org. The chair and staff are responsible for conducting an orderly hearing. Any testimony or behavior which is deemed inappropriate will be addressed and may result in that member of the public being removed from the hearing. Questions to and from the chair may be entertained at any time at the chair's discretion. Cross-examination of people testifying is not allowed. However, if any person wishes to ask a question of another, please direct your question to the chair after being recognized. The chair is free to decide whether or not to ask such questions of the person testifying. Prior to the commencement of the hearing, any party may challenge the qualifications of any commissioner for conflict of interest. This challenge must be documented with specific reasons supported by facts. Should any commissioner be challenged, the member may disqualify himself or herself, withdraw from the hearing, or make a statement on the record of their capacity to hear and decide this issue. At this time, do any members of the commission need to set forth any information that may be perceived as a conflict of interest?
Does any commissioner have anything to disclose? And if so, please state the nature and same and whether you can proceed. Okay,
Excellent. Hearing none, apologies. Does any party wish to challenge any commissioner, member of the hearings body based on conflicts of interest?
okay. As no challenges are presented, the hearing is now open. Staff will proceed with the brief report.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to provide a bit of background on this issue, temporary hardship dwellings or temporary medical hardship dwellings have been allowed in Deschutes County since 1979. Currently, we have about 143 properties that have active approvals for the temporary hardship dwellings. And on average, I included this in the staff report. In the last 2 years, we received about 18 new applications in non-resource zones. And over the last 2 years, we received about 7 new applications in resource zones, so farm and forest zones. The intent of this hardship dwelling is to allow for the care of the property owner or relative with a medical condition. So essentially allows a second dwelling on a property where a primary dwelling already exists for someone to be able to come to that property and provide care essentially to the property owner or their relative. We require annual renewal through a doctor's note. So to confirm that there is still a medical condition that requires care each year, the property owner or their relative needs to submit a doctor's note that essentially says, yes, the medical condition still exists and I still need care. The state regulates medical hardship dwellings in resource zones. So because there aren't really any requirements for non-resource zones, essentially counties throughout Oregon have adopted those same regulations, whether or not you're in a resource zone or a non-resource zone. And that's because a lot of these requirements essentially have already been vetted by the state for compliance with things like Goal 14. So that's what we've done locally in our code. We've adopted most of the same requirements as the state, but added a few extra conditions that fit Deschutes County more specifically. But recently, since our last code update, it appears that state law has changed to be slightly more flexible than our current code. So in state requirements right now, it doesn't have to be a property owner or a property owner's relative who is eligible for receiving care. It could just be a resident of the property if they're renting that property, for instance. Additionally, the state rules changed to allow care for an aged person as well as an infirmed person. So this might be someone who's, getting older and doesn't necessarily have a specific medical condition, but just requires care associated with aging, with getting older. Additionally, in the state rules, they have a 2-year renewal period compared to our 1-year renewal period, again, giving some more flexibility for when that doctor's note needs to be submitted. I wanted to note one of the key differences between how we regulate hardship dwellings in the EFU forest zone or resource zone compared to outside of that on, say residential zones. In the EFU forest zone, this requires a conditional use permit because you still have to show compliance with farm impacts test to show that the temporary hardship dwelling won't interfere with farming or forestry practices. But outside of resource zones, it's reviewed through a temporary use permit application, so it's a little bit more streamlined. I wanted to note, one key difference from the last time we discussed this at the work session with the Planning Commission, we were explaining this in the way that essentially the caregiver and the person receiving care had to be related. But actually, we were able to find, after some great questions from the Planning Commission, a LUBA case from 2021 from Lane County that actually found several kind of key things that we wanted to note here. So LUBA has interpreted state rule. So these are essentially the case law requirements we need to abide by. The person suffering the hardship needs to be an existing resident or relative of the resident. That person who's suffering the hardship needs to live in the primary dwelling, so the dwelling that's already in existence. The person who's providing care needs to be living in that temporary dwelling, but LUBA found that the person living in that temporary dwelling, the caregiver, does not need to be related. So the only people that need to be related are essentially the person who's receiving care. It needs to either be that resident or relative of the resident. But a caregiver, someone who's paid, let's say a nurse, can be brought on the property to live in an RV, manufactured home, or in resource zones currently existing. I wanted to note that key difference. What we're proposing through these amendments are what we're calling kind of some cleanup with a few policy choices. So we are proposing to reorganize the content for readability. Right now, some requirements are in our EFU forest zone sections and others are in 18-11690, which is our supplemental provisions. So we're essentially just trying to put everything in one place so it's a little bit easier to read. We're amending some outdated references. For instance, how we describe septic systems. It's a bit outdated in the terminology. We're clarifying to comply with state rule that hardship dwellings can be used for the aged as well as the infirmed, and amending that renewal requirement from 1 year to 2 years, and clarifying that residents are eligible for this as well as property owners. We're also proposing to allow use of existing building for a temporary hardship dwelling in non-resource zones. Right now, you're only limited to an RV or manufactured home. So kind of adding a little bit more flexibility in the dwelling type, and also clarifying the definition, which I'll go into a little bit later in our policy choices. We're also clarifying that the hardship dwelling can be the only second dwelling on the property. So if you have a guest house or an ADU, or once approved by the board, RV as a residence, you can get a hardship dwelling, really kind of only get one of those options off the menu. And the last item is we are listing the use in all permissible zones, just so it's clear what zones it's allowed in versus not. So some of the policy choices that we're proposing to the Planning Commission for discussion, the first one is related to how we define an existing building. So right now in our code, if you wanted to use an existing building for your hardship dwelling, that building needed to have existed on or before March 29th, 2017. That date essentially came from the last time we did a minor update to this code. So there wasn't a specific reason for having it be that date. Other than that, it was just when that new code was coming into effect. So we're proposing to change that date for an existing building to be eligible as long as it's had a final inspection at least 2 years prior to the application date. So if it's newer than that, it doesn't qualify as existing, but it allows for kind of a rolling date for eligibility. So it in the long run will create a little bit more flexibility there. One of the other policy choices for the Planning Commission relates to restrictions on modifications of structures or additions to structures or RVs. So for existing buildings, and typically an existing building would be something like an accessory structure on a property, something like a garage with living space above, a art studio, a man cave, kind of a pole barn, things like that. Currently, we don't regulate if you're, adding on to that or modifying it in any way for it to be fit for a temporary dwelling. In this case, we are proposing to limit that to modifications only within the existing floor area. And this came from concerns from our building division that essentially when folks are taking an approved accessory structure and converting it to a temporary hardship, really those modifications should be so that they're easy to convert back once the use is no longer needed. So it would allow for things like adding a closet potentially, or adding, wiring for a stove or a refrigerator, but it wouldn't allow for you to add on extensively to a building and make it essentially a full second, dwelling on the property, full duplex or something that's permanent. So that's an item for the Planning Commission to review and weigh in on. And also for RVs, currently we prohibit permanent additions to RVs, and this is just due to concerns regarding life safety building requirements. So we are proposing to maintain that, but it could be an option for the Planning Commission to remove that restriction. The second or the third item that we're looking for input on relates to RV components. So currently, if you're proposing to use an RV as a temporary hardship dwelling, it needs to be fully licensed, highway ready, on wheels or a jacking system, attached to the site by quick disconnect utilities and have a bathroom. And really the goal of that is to ensure that these are operational, habitable RVs to avoid it being essentially kind of a broken down RV stuck on a property. So we're proposing to keep all of those, but clarify that a bathroom really means sink and a toilet. Some of these RVs might not have a full shower. They might have, kind of bathing facilities, but not a full quote unquote bathroom as you might see in a house. So wanted to provide some slight flexibility there, and kind of use some of the lessons learned from the RV as residents proposal process. With that, just wanted to note, we did receive 2 agency comments, one from Redmond Fire, expressing interest in revisiting forest road standards to make them more compliant with Oregon Fire Code. We noted that's a bit out of the scope of this amendment, so we added it to the list of future amendments that we'll work on. And they were totally comfortable with that. And we also received a comment from the county transportation planner noting that the proposal complies with Goal 12 and there's no major transportation impacts resulting from this process. We did receive one public comment a few days ago, generally expressing support for the amendments. They did have a question about how do you monitor the inhabitant of the dwelling to make sure that it's someone who needs that care and it's not just, a new tenant. So I responded, and it's in the record, about our current process of how we review those doctor's notes annually and kind of our code enforcement process. With that, the Planning Commission has several options to move forward after hearing testimony this evening. You could choose to continue the hearing to a date and time certain, close the hearing and leave the written record open to a date certain, close the hearing and set a date for deliberations, or close the hearing and commence deliberations. And with that, I welcome any questions.
Any questions? If not, we'll go ahead and start the hearing. First on the agenda, first person up, I have, looks like a couple of Pattersons. Sorry, I can't read your names. Oh, just one. Oh, just come up to the mic and you've got a few minutes. Tell us what you'd like.
Well, we just came here to find out what's going on with the hardship. We are buying a piece of property.
Excuse me, could you state your name and address, please?
It's Leanne Patterson, address 68405 Friar Road in Sisters. We are purchasing another property, actually on Friar, but on the Bend side, for our daughter and her family. And the intention initially was to add an ADU for her mother-in-law, who's 75 years old, and she's got some disability issues. We have all the requirements for an ADU with the exception of the water company, which is Sun Mountain, will not sign a letter allowing us to put an ADU in currently because they say they don't have capacity, enough water capacity. So our other option, of course, is a hardship. And I believe that we meet the criteria because the home is for her elderly mother-in-law. And so we just wanted to come and find out a little bit more about what these proposals were to make sure that we qualified and see if there were any issues that might directly affect us.
Okay, thank you. Did Nicole answer your questions with her explanation?
I believe so. The only question I had, I don't remember if it was called LUBA, and you said something about the aged or infirmed person needs to live in the main residence. Is that something you're proposing, or for the person to live in the hardship home?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks for reminding me to spell out my acronyms. So LUBA stands for the Land Use Board of Appeals. So that's essentially the state appellate court that's specific for land use decisions. So yes, LUBA essentially noted that the existing resident who is suffering the hardship or relative who's suffering the hardship must reside in the permanent existing dwelling. And then the caregiver can live in an RV or a manufactured home or, a separate existing accessory building.
But is that something you're proposing?
That is not something we're proposing. That came from the state appellate court. So it's essentially what we call case law. So because the state court weighed in and interpreted this sometimes ambiguous state rule, we have to follow that interpretation. So we would have to administer it into our code, even though we're not the ones proposing it.
So is it going to be an issue for the aged person living in the hardship home? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, so the person who's suffering the hardship, aged or infirmed, would need to live in the primary dwelling. So I don't believe that they'd be eligible to live in an RV or manufactured home, but Will Groves is our planning manager. He's here to weigh in as well.
Kind of defeats the purpose of a hardship home if they're right next to the.
Yeah, it would sound like it's the opposite of what your intent is, but maybe Will can add something.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Your planning manager, Will Groves, commissioners. So that case is really convoluted. The case that we're trying to extract information from, there was somebody who was a resident of the property, but not a resident of the dwelling. There were multiple manufactured homes, multiple RVs on the property. And so the case is really difficult to read. But the important thing to take out of it, and there's a nuance to, I think, what Nicole was communicating, is that there is a person who is the resident. So in order to get to a manufactured home, there's to get to a hardship dwelling, there's a couple things you have to cross through. There has to be a resident. So there's somebody who's living in a house on the property. They're person one. There has to be a hardship. That hardship has to be suffered by the resident or the resident's relative. And the resident who, is the person in the first place, who may be the hardship person or maybe somebody who has a relative with a hardship, has to continue to reside in the primary dwelling. So a scenario that I think many people use and is still allowed is, I am a healthy homeowner, but my kin folk is ailing and I want to have them in an RV or manufactured home so that I can take care of them. Totally allowed. The case, what was weird in this case is that the person who was the on property, the healthy person on property, didn't reside in the primary dwelling. And that made the case really difficult to read. So yeah, just to your point, just to dig a little deeper into that, as long as there's a resident and the resident or relative has a hardship, those are really the key gates to get through. So, you could have a scenario where I'm the ailing resident of the dwelling and I have an unrelated caregiver live in the manufactured home or RV. I could have a scenario where I'm the resident and I have an ailing relative living in the manufactured home and RV, and I also have a caregiver who's living in that manufactured home or RV. So there's no notion that the resident necessarily needs to be providing the care. It's a relatively simple gate in that there is a resident, the resident has a hardship or their relative has a hardship, and that the resident is in the primary dwelling. After that, there's not a lot of sideboards on it.
Okay, did that answer your questions?
Yes, it does. Just one other question. I think you talk about infirm or aged, right? Is there a definition for aged?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is no definition for aged. It comes from Oregon Administrative Rule, the state requirements. We talked with our coordinated kind of services division with planning, building, code enforcement, and there wasn't a strong desire from staff to define that to allow for more flexibility. But that is an item that the Planning Commission could utilize public input on.
Yeah. Well, I know when you have elder care, it can be anybody from 55 older. And then lastly, whether it's aged or infirm, whatever the case may be, you still need a letter every 2 years, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. And with regard to the aged, my presumption is that if you get a doctor's note that says, hey, relative or resident is, of an age that, and is having stated difficulties that come with age and would benefit from having care from a relative, that's going to pass through that threshold, no problem. I think if we had somebody who was who was otherwise well, but just up there and was like, hey, I benefit from on property, but I don't have a doctor's note. I think we may, we'll have to try to figure out what that looks like in those situations. But certainly somebody who can get a doctor's note that says, I'm getting up there, it would help for me to be near my relatives. We're going to pass those through without difficulty.
Great, thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
I was gonna say there's some days I qualify for that one.
Yes, me too.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Crystal clear, Will. So in their situation, the mother-in-law could move an RV onto the property and live into it.
Yes.
Meet if they met all the criteria.
Yes, because what you've got is you've got a resident, check. You've got a relative who meets the definition of relative, who has a hardship. And at that point, you're allowed to put a manufactured home or RV on the property. I think something that's not spelled out in code, but we've run into is I'm ailing and I have, I'm the resident, I'm ailing, and I'm going to put a manufactured home on the property. I'm going to VRBO it to achieve income to help with my care. That there's a LUBA case that doesn't fly.
I feel like I need to reread this because I read it as in like the infirmed needs to be in the residence and the caregiver needs to be in the second dwelling. And that's how I read it. So I'm going to reread it because that's how I interpret it. Right?
Yeah, it would be good. It would be good to double check this because it is confusing to try and track all the permutations of it, but very clearly from the case, the case law is very clear on that. That the scenario that you described is one that's allowed.
Yeah.
Healthy resident in a primary dwelling, ailing relative in a manufactured home or RV.
That's why I sought clarification on that.
Mhm.
One other question that my husband actually brought up. Eventually, we would like to convert this from a hardship into an ADU. As long as we meet all the criteria for the county for the ADU, that's not going to be a problem, right?
Well,
Oh.
you'd have to go through the process.
No, right.
of
I
it.
understand that.
I don't think any of us could say that won't be a problem at this point until there's an actual application in front of somebody.
But you're asking a great question. My planning team's available. So you'd say, hey, I'm going to put this medical hardship on the property. If I were to, at some point in the future, apply for it as an ADU, would it meet all the qualifications that are, and one of the things that there can be some things that are squirrely about it, about the location of it and also
Yeah,
the construction.
so-
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what our intention is to meet the requirements for the ADU,
Mhm.
but use it as a hardship until
Mhm.
that.
And that's an interesting choice. If Chair, if you'll entertain this,
Sure, go
I'm
ahead.
interested in this question. I've always assumed that somebody would go directly to the ADU because it's unrestricted. So as soon as you get the ADU, anybody can live in it. And to the extent that it's used as a hardship, I assumed that no one would take the hardship and then ADU option. So what's
Well, I-
persuasive in that
Yeah.
case?
You heard when I started the
Mm,
conversation,
please.
but our intention was to make it an ADU.
Yep.
We're required to get a letter from the water
Oh,
company.
yes.
saying
Thank
that
you.
they'll provide service.
Thank you.
So it's a backdoor ADU once you get the service, assuming that you still get a letter from the water company down
Yes.
the road.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So in her case, I'm grateful to have this case because I love these real life scenarios because it helps me understand this better. So thank you guys for bringing this forward. But in this case, because it's a hardship case, could the water company deny them service, or is it a
They said they would deny us an ADU, but they would not deny a hardship.
a hardship? Okay,
And that's entirely in the water provider's
in
court.
their jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Do we have any other public comments? Do we have anybody online? All right. Oh, Vice Chair?
Thank you, Chair. Nicole, I just had some little like typo type things that I caught. Could I just send those to you separately and they could be entered into the record or whatever? I mean, I don't feel like we need to go through them, but
I think that's a great question, Commissioner. And it sounds like I think it would be helpful for us to enter the LUBA case into the record as
Yeah.
well, and then some further analysis. So I'd recommend an open record period so that we could enter that as staff, and then you could send me the, clerical error edits.
thank you.
Okay,
Question.
go ahead.
in my practice, I see a lot of these hardship, like, so in an RV, it's easy to take off the property when the hardship has been, when it's no longer needed. But like in a manufactured home, you know, it's more permanent than, and you see a lot of these manufactured homes still on the property. And often like when sales happen, the county is notified that it's still there and it's still being used as a secondary residence. Only if maybe a change of use happens or convert, like I just see these a lot in the county through real estate transactions. And so I totally support this, but I just see the aftermaths a lot. And so I'm just kind of curious, how is the county then alerted? Like, oh, you didn't renew like you guys aren't going to go check on it. Or do you? Or can you give me some clarification?
I can start and then Will can fill in any gaps. So we do with the, of course, renewal process with every 1 year now, but every 2 years with this change. And I wanted to note that part of the reason that we think that the 2-year cycle may have been added by the state, we talked about this with our code enforcement division, is that some folks who are needing to receive care may only have one doctor's visit a year covered by their insurance or Medicare. So we have seen it with code enforcement where someone says, hey, it's time for my renewal, but I'm not able to get to my doctor for 2 months because I only get one visit covered a year. So it is helpful to have that additional 2-year window for flexibility. How this relates to your question is that, yes, we do require that renewal process. So you have to submit your doctor's note and you have to clarify, yes, I am, the same person who's listed as the person needing care. I still have that medical issue. If we don't receive that within the year, and Will can kind of go into our reporting of how we do that, then essentially a code enforcement case is opened and we need to essentially investigate that. If the use is no longer needed, if the person is no longer needing care or doesn't live on the property, then it needs to be converted within essentially 90 days to either an allowed use in the zone, or it needs to be demolished or just removed from the property. Our code enforcement division is, it essentially tries to, work with property owners to do this. I think part of it is that if you're seeing these throughout, they're not being caught through this annual renewal process. Part of it is also alerting code enforcement through the county, which we have a reporting form on our website. Because there may have been one that was approved, as a hardship dwelling in the 2000s, but they may just not be in our system to check for renewals. So it could have maybe slipped through the cracks that way. So recommend you always report a code enforcement violation if you see one. Will, is there anything else you wanted to add?
That's an excellent answer. It's important to note that when we cease to get the doctor's notes, that will result in a process by which either the RV is, taken out of use, or that the manufactured home is either removed from the property or decommissioned. And decommissioned involves capping of any cutting of any 220 wiring, capping of gas lines, gas service lines in a kitchen area. So basically it's designed to effectively sabotage the kitchen. But, there's limits to that. That's nothing that anybody who's industrious couldn't put back in, a few hours, especially with some professional help. And it happens. So, at that point, there's no follow on after that. And we definitely see these things reconverted to residential use. And that does put some burden on neighbors to, then have to complain about their neighbor in a way that's discoverable ultimately. So I think this is a difficulty. And I think one of the reasons, so you note that in the current amendments, we're exploring matching state law to allow existing structures to be allowed as medical hardship dwellings. And in practice, we're going to see things like barn dominiums. And we'll see, I think that we'll see other structures, outbuildings, added, residential units added to those. And at the end of that, they will have to be decommissioned. And some of them will be recommissioned as soon as, we turn our backs. And so the reason why a prior planning commission and board did not extend the state permission for medical hardships in existing buildings was to frustrate this potential of these existing buildings being turned into long-term residences. But in the current proposal, I think that you're seeing at least as we set the table, and not to prejudice you as you think about it, because, you know, there are other planning commissioners and other boards have thought different ways in the past, is that the manufactured home is subject to the same problem, that, you know, it can be recommissioned fairly easily. You know, RVs can be moved into fairly easily, and that manufactured homes are a relatively difficult thing to put on a property. I don't know if any of you have dealt with that, but the financing is weird. They depreciate like crazy. You know, they tend not to have a secondary use case. You know, you'd think that you could sell them to somebody else, but that's just not economical in many circumstances. So recognizing that, you know, in an appropriate use case, you have a medical hardship, you've got a family member in your barn dominium, and, you know, at the end of that point, you can turn that into, you know, a man cave, an ADU, a she shed, you know, that there's a variety of beneficial property uses, whereas the manufactured home tends to turn into garbage.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Chair would entertain a motion on what you want to do. We
I'll make a
can,
motion.
we can continue the hearing. We can close the hearing. Oh, excuse me, Commissioner Williams.
I would move to close the hearing, both written and oral, and move to deliberations. I don't see a lot of public input.
Is there a second? Okay, seeing as there's no second, the motion dies. Is there any other suggestions? Vice Chair.
I move to close the hearing and to leave the record open for written testimony, because I know that there's something that I would like to submit, and perhaps if there are other members of the public who would like to submit their comments. When's our next meeting?
Our next meeting is on March 27th, and usually the
Oh, right.
packet is due by midday on March, the Thursday before, so that would be March 20th.
I think a week would be sufficient for comments. So I would say to close the written record on March 19th.
Okay, is there a second?
I would second that.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to close the hearing and leave the written record open until close of day on March 19th. Any discussion?
I believe that Nicole wanted to have the Luba case, so I just feel like that's kind of the reason that, and Susan wanted to add comments, so that's why I think that we wanted to leave it open.
Okay. Any other discussion?
Back then after the record's closed for further deliberation, or does it need done?
Yeah, we'll still have deliberations most likely at our next meeting.
We'll plan for March 27th for deliberation.
Okay. So seeing as no other discussion, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right, next item on the agenda. Let me find my agenda here. Here we go. Work session, clear and objective housing text amendments, Title 19, or excuse me, Title 17.
Very correct. Yeah, thank you very much, Commissioners. For the record, I'm Tarek Rawling, Senior Transportation Planner with the Community Development Department and the Road Department. I'm just getting logged on here, and I'll share a brief PowerPoint with you. I think we also have maybe two representatives, at least one online from our consultant team. They're MIG out of Portland. And I'll, without a ton more delay here, I'll just get started with the PowerPoint here. Yeah, so we have Kate Rogers is from our consultant team, MIG, and so is Matt Hasty. They're both attending remotely, and thank you both for being here. And I'll just share my. Yeah. So yeah, today, exactly like you'd said, Chair Cyrus, this is a work session for what the second segment of our clear and objective housing text amendment project. This is related to Title 17, which is our subdivision section. This is for file number 247-25-110-TA. And this is in preparation for the public hearing that'll be 2 weeks from today on March 27th. We have a full record, and the project website is available on your screen here. It's bit.ly/Deschutes Clear and Objective Title 17. There's it's fairly early in the process. We have some notices and things on that right now. I'll just go briefly into some background and overview. I know you just went through the Title 18 portion, so this is really the exact same framing around that House bill and around that state law requirement for us to comply conform our code language to what that state law dictates. So I'll try to be brief about it, knowing you guys just went through this process fairly recently. As we kind of briefly went through, it's responsive to state law. This becomes effective on July 1st of this year. And this is really overall designed to support housing supply by requiring local governments to create clear and objective standards for housing and housing development. And overall, it's an effort to amend the code language in Title 17 to avoid discretionary code language that can discourage or have the potential to discourage needed housing through unnecessary cost or delay. There is an allowance through the state law and through the language of the statute that allows for a discretionary review path in addition to a clear and objective review path. So you have these options for local governments to include both in their approach to this text amendment requirement. Gives some of flexibility for applicants if they either choose not to pursue the clear and objective option or can't pursue it for whatever their proposal dictates. So it allows flexibility on both ends. Overall, our overall approach has been to identify the areas of the Deschutes County Code that are not in conformance with the statute. And then we've just kind of how you've seen in the Title 18 portion, we've done a lot of redlining for the actual text itself to address each issue where there's discretionary language and where it needs to be made clear and objective. And so this is the second segment of that. We've tried to break this into sort of digestible sequences. I'll go over what some of the future amendment packages will look like, but this is the second of what will be several that you'll be reviewing in light of this same requirement here. It gives a little more structure to the overall sequencing of things too, and allows for the public also to engage with it a little more effectively. So this is it's the title of Title 17 is our subdivisions, but it relates really to land divisions generally. But so this text amendment package addresses anything that's related specifically to housing or housing development explicitly. And then a lot of what's in that title is around lot configuration standards and how properties are laid out through land divisions and how they're platted. Our general approach was to retain existing regulations where possible. And in many sections, this might be a little different than the definitional module, was that there's sort of process layout in a lot of these code processes here in these sections. And so where that was discretionary in the original language, we've offered what we call a 2-track system. So we have the discretionary as this sort of original unamended text. And then we broke apart new text that's an option for clear and objective review. So that's largely what you'll see as the amended added language as part of this Title 17 module. And so just a little more detail on what's in Title 17. There's land division platting. So requirements for how to submit those plans, what those plans require. Much of that's dictated by Oregon revised statute, state law authorities that are afforded to the county engineer and county surveyor and entities like that. Lots of lot design criteria around configuration, layout, size, different where general adequacy for things like utilities and access and then there's layout in terms of access as well. So frontage on roads, how roads are designed and laid out into different subdivisions and partitions, as well as some standards for different modes of transportation like biking and pedestrian travel. There's some sections on park development, and then there's also sections on road dedications. And you'll see that there's amendments and strike throughs pretty much through all of those various sections. So we've published notice for this upcoming public hearing. We've received no public or agency comments to date. And then kind of how I'd mentioned earlier, this is the second of several amendments that'll be coming before both the Planning Commission and the Board of County Commissioners eventually. What'll likely be the next module will be the Goal 5 resources. And this is all the same thing, creating clear and objective text amendments from what is the existing discretionary components of our code. Our Goal 5 resources are the landscape management combining zones, wildlife area zones, wetlands, and scenic resources, Goal 5 resources as we generally term them. Then there will be a module on cluster and plan development standards. Those are very specific types of sort of land divisions and layouts in a separate module. And then any additional sections that have to do with housing or housing development. So just as this, moves through the Planning Commission phase and through the Board of County Commissioners phase, and I know this has been explained to you just in the first module as well, but we're still keeping an eye on case law and how this statute would evolve over time. So if there's any changes in the applicability of the law or additional requirements, we're keeping an eye on what really would continue to be a refinement process, probably for quite a while even after this is foreseeably adopted before the July 1st deadline. So just keep that in mind. This is a really good initial effort, lots of coordination between the road department, the county surveyor, our consultant team, current planning, long range planning teams. But we're always looking to see how we could further refine it and improve those amendments. And really with that, there's some information here. I'll just repeat the record website. It's bit.ly/Deschutes Clear and Objective Title 17. And my contact information is on the screen here, but really this is just in prep for 2 weeks from now where we'll have our public hearing. And we'll go into a little more detail about the text and things there, but I figured I'd give you a bit of an overview here. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. We also have our consultant team online if there's any questions for them.
Great, thank you. Any questions? Commissioner Hofkamp.
Eric, thanks for the opportunity to ask questions. I asked the same question of your colleague Kyle Collins in connection with the last tranche of clear and objective updates that we got, and he gave me a good answer, but I've largely forgotten that, and I want your answer.
Sure.
So, and it has to do with this 2-track system. So, as I'm understanding it, the clear and objective update is to come into compliance with relatively new state law, and I think I understand that. So going forward, the intention is to have these 2 tracks, clear and objective, and then kind of the existing discretionary language and so forth. So I'm just wondering how that's going to play out. So an applicant or an entity can come for review or submit an application for review and say, I want this to go under the clear and objective, and here's how I meet these standards and requirements. Or I have something that is a proposal that involves some elements that don't fall neatly within these clear and objective. I've got a creative this or that or whatever. And I think the discretionary language is probably more appropriate, or the discretionary tract is more appropriate for a review of this. So number one is having a 2-track process where one's clear and objective and one is existing and discretionary. First of all, is it compliant with the new state mandate that requires clear and objective? That's the first question. And then just secondly, Tarek, your take on if I've got that more or less right, or still trying to drill this in my head. And maybe with each iteration, each tranche, I'm going to get less likely to ask the same question of your colleagues, but I appreciate your take on it, sir.
Of course. No, I appreciate the question. It's really, and it's, I think, a bit distinct from maybe the Title 18 module where a lot of that is really cleanly kind of supplanting what a definition would be, or really what the meaning of it would be.
Right.
This is a lot more procedural, I would say, sometimes in how the language just is actually formatted. But I think maybe a big picture to your point is that it's not like you pick one option, clear and objective or discretionary, and then run it through the entire title. You'd go piecemeal through each
Oh.
provision. So it's really, you can, until you get to something discretionary where, yeah, you have certain circumstances, property specific or history of the property that comes into conflict with the clear and objective standards, then you default back to the discretionary standard. Is the idea there. It's that if you can't check that, I've heard that metaphor used, if you can't check the box on that list, so to speak, then you default back to the discretionary standard, but just for that standalone provision. Then you could, in theory, go walk back to the other, as you move through the other applicable provisions and apply it in a clear, objective manner.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Terry.
Of course,
Makes
sure.
sense. I'm just, I'm wondering if there's precedent for this with other updates, and if this is going to create a headache for the review authority, or if it's realistic, how if we thought it through. And it's uncharted territory, I guess, in regards to this specific clear and objective mandate, but
Yeah, and I might just begin, and then, yeah, Will's
Yeah.
always a wealth of knowledge. I would say it's exactly as you said, it's uncharted territory, especially many of these, what we were calling many really general engineering standards, things like that were really difficult to fit into a lot of clear and objective boxes. That if, for one, there's a lot of third-party external certifications and things like that, stuff that's under other provisions of even federal law that we can't necessarily just move into a clear and objective format. And so there's components like that are really it's precedent setting just to even deal with those under sort of the umbrella of, or through the lens of, this new state law mandate. But I think overall it's kind of our first genuine attempt. At the same time, and I wonder if this is maybe what Will is going to go into, so I won't steal too much of the details, but there is a pending case law out of Cannon Beach that we'll go into a little more detail, especially at the public hearing. But it's still under review at the Supreme Court level of the state. Even it's gone all the way up. It came out of the Court of Appeals from a LUBA decision, largely saying that these sort of road standards, things like that, utility standards, for instance, are not necessarily under this scope of requiring to be clear and objective. That's something that we're tracking and keeping an eye on amongst really anything else, any other case law that evolves over the course of this review. But that might have been what I'll toss it as well, in case that was even just part of what he was thinking.
that's provocative too. I wonder if we're doubling the review work with a two-track process with the same staff we have. And I'm also wondering about appeals processes when it goes up.
Yeah, all great. Oh, I'm loud. All great questions. Again, Will Groves, your planning manager. The first question that you asked was, is this two-track process allowed? And 197A-400 expressly allows jurisdictions to have, they requires jurisdictions to have a clear and objective process. And once that exists, it allows jurisdictions to have a discretionary process as an alternative, provided that it achieves basically the same effect.
Okay.
So that is expressly allowed. Is this a matter, is this precedential? Cities have been exposed to this regulation for a long time. And so, we looked at the city of Bend's code, talked to them directly about their experience of this. We talked to the city of Eugene, who's made some very significant efforts. And what, we were hearing both from those jurisdictions as well as the state is that no one's code is clear and objective. And what's happened is a kind of an effort, a piecemeal effort over time to fix places where people have thought about this. So, for example, the city of Bend had a requirement that when you were installing utilities associated with housing developments, that the sewer line needed to be close to some other feature. I forget what it was, the sidewalk. And the developer didn't like that location, and it was taken to LUBA, and LUBA concluded that close was not clear and objective. And so then the city's back in refining that, that you have to be within X feet of this. So I think what we're going to see is a continual iteration. The changes that you'll see us bring to you as staff are places where we thought that reasonable people would be flummoxed to try to understand what the code was asking, especially when applications where criteria talks about orderly development. So you're going to see us approach these, and it'll be interesting to see, to Tark's point, both how the case law and legislation evolves. So simultaneously, and you'll hear more about this at the hearing, there's a case out of Cannon Beach that's looking to refine kind of the outer boundaries of what must be clear and objective. In particular, our off-site improvements. For example, if you need to pave a road to get to a house, and you can't have the house if the road isn't paved, is that off-site improvement all the standards that it is operated under? Does it have to be clear and objective? LUBA said no. It's appealed to the Supreme Court. Not sure how that'll turn out. And there's an active bill in the legislature to preemptively walk back that Cannon Beach case. So lots of moving pieces about what this, the boundaries of what clear and objective are. We're going to continue moving with our best legal advice, and what the case law is at the day. But we may, if we get a Supreme Court decision in the middle of this, we may pivot, appropriately. To your final question about the difficulty of maintaining multiple tracks, yes, there's just a lot more code to maintain. And I don't know if you've ever been subjected to a programming course, but it's called code for a reason. You put input in, and it's supposed to cause output, orderly development to come out, and getting everything to plug in and ensure that it's not easily circumvented and also doesn't produce unnecessary headaches for the users of the code is a constant struggle. And so we've spent a lot of energy building. I think I've described this before. It feels to me like a little bit like we're building like the HOV lanes on the freeway. If you meet some very, the freeway remains. And if you meet some very narrow categories, in this case, you have 2 passengers or 3 passengers in your car, you're allowed to go in the fast lane. And so we, through these clear and objective standards, are not closing any lanes. We're building a fast lane, but we also have to maintain and make sure it's operational and make sure that it's also usable. If we accidentally say that the HOV lane, I'm going to extend the metaphor, requires 17 passengers, then nobody uses it, and we've built a lot of code infrastructure for nothing. So really trying to get that balance just right. And luckily, the cities have preceded us in this and have given us some clues on how to approach this work. And I think it will be a source of ongoing litigation over the years.
Well, so correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand it. Yeah, I think your metaphor is perfect.
Mhm.
From my understanding is essentially there's a clear and objective standards track that essentially eliminates the planning process. Or I mean, if you can check all the boxes, a computer could give you your approval.
That's
And if you've got a box or two that you can't check, then it goes back to staff for review, and that's when subjective comes in. And there's discretion involved with that. But in theory, it could fast track a lot of applications if they can meet the standards.
That's the big goal here. And this is why this is such an important part of, I think, the spirit of this law. There's a lot of work we're putting into this, a lot of effort we're putting into it. And it's removing in some ways, the expertise that planners bring to this field. We've been asked by the community over the years to say, hey, take a look at this thing, and, we'll try and decide if something's good, bad, or ugly, and then we'll provide a public process to have that discussion. And the goal here, but the problem with that is it's expensive and cumbersome. It's confusing to applicants. They don't have the certainty of the outcome at the outset. They don't know what application materials will ultimately succeed. And so this, I think you're seeing a big change in both planning and legislatures towards this, where it's, we want the rules to be simple enough that, any reasonable person could say, look, I did X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to walk out with the permit, and it's unappealable because I did X, Y, and Z. And that simplification, I think, particularly in, our state, but certainly the nation's struggle to build housing, and the ways that appeals have frustrated that ability to build housing and have discouraged people who might otherwise build housing because it's unclear how they get to it. I think that there's a big movement broadly across the planning community to do more of this. We may be, if we do it perfectly, we may be putting ourselves out of jobs, but I'd like to see more housing. I think we all would. So we're very much in favor of trying to make these possibilities available to people and simplify this process.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions? Vice Chair.
Thank you. So I'm looking at it. It was noted in a couple of different places, but the first place I see it is page 2 of 6 of Tarek's memo. And item 3C states the approval criteria for the alternative approval process authorize a density at or above the density level authorized in the zone under the approval process provided in subsection 1 of this section. Could you explain that to me?
Law language, is that what you're?
Yeah, I like how, I guess I just don't understand. You can, what I questioned, what I wrote is, so you can forego clear and objective standards for more density? Like, I kind of don't understand what that means.
And it might be that that's something more on like the urban application of that exact segment of the state law. If I can, I might just be able to.
I would guess it probably has something to do with if you meet other certain subjective standards, you might be able to get credits or bonuses. For example, if you've got a cluster subdivision, you can get a bonus credit of 7.5 acre density versus a 10 acre density. But I'm just guessing without seeing the statute, but there may be some subjective things that you could do that would allow bonuses.
Vice Chair, would you remind me just the exact?
This is at 197A 403C, and it says specifically, and this is under 3, in addition to an approval process for needed housing based on clear and objective standards, a local government may adopt alternative approval that allows residential development based on discretionary criteria. I'm paraphrasing here. If the approval criteria for the alternate, so the non-clear and objective pathway, authorizes a density at or above the level authorized in the zone under the approval process through the clear and objective. So, ideally you match that, that the clear and objective lane and the regular lane gets you to the same place, but you are allowed to authorize above a higher density through a discretionary process. So just to Chair Cyrus's point, through for example, a discretionary cluster subdivision or PUD, you'd be able to say, look, you'd think that X units per Y acres is the appropriate metric here by default. In the clear and objective lane, you will always get an approval when you come in for that. If you want to come in for more, that's something that's not precluded by state law, but you would need to show, through discretionary process, hey, is this good in the neighborhood? Are the parks adequate? And, a jurisdiction might ask, are the parks adequate to put more units in at this point? So it's an allowed provision. And you'll see this when we bring you the Goal 5 chapters, a little bit of a preview of that we'll be dealing with this exact issue in the planned unit developments. If you think about them, basically they say, you want to do a subdivision? Okay, all bets are off. Let's talk. Like, what's a good subdivision look like here? What's a good combination? Setbacks, lot sizes, let's go. What works here? And, and it's the broadest type of thinking that's associated with it. It's allowed in very limited zones and very specific circumstances. But once you unlock that, you can have those discussions, and those you'll see in the Goal 5 that we've characterized those as inherently discretionary processes. A paint by number PUD breaks the very notion of a PUD because it's designed to respond dynamically to a particular situation.
Yeah, I think maybe some of that may come in, or maybe the language is gone. I know there used to be some stuff as far as minimum lot sizes that more nearly match the community. You could make changes that apply to a different standard if in fact it matched the surrounding landscape and the other lots. For example, if you got 2-acre minimum subdivisions adjacent to this particular piece of property, maybe the 10-acre minimum isn't appropriate for that based on surrounding development patterns type thing. And then, that kind of language may not still be on the books, but there used to be some allowances to more nearly match the adjacent neighborhoods.
And there are similar provisions. For example, in the MUA 10 and RR 10 zone, for example, if you do cluster subdivisions, leaving large open spaces, you're given bonus lots, development lots in association with that. I don't want to get too much off into a tangent. There's been some recent case law out of Clackamas that went to LUBA that talked about your ability to extend those from beyond kind of the lands historically that they were allowed in. So There's some if, ands, and buts about that, but generally speaking, that notion is that through discretionary processes, state law doesn't preclude you from authorizing additional units.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No, Commissioner Kelly. Your turn.
I had a question, and I don't know why this question came up as I was reading, but I wrote it down. So I'm kind of curious. I don't know exactly where it pertains to, but right now the UGB is slightly larger than the city limits in some parts. Why don't they share the same boundary?
I mean, where it comes up, it looks like there's in some, and this is my understanding of, probably not as close as I should have, just the exact city's annexation process, but there's a reserve kind of holding area that the
Mhm.
city holds that's in between city limits, so to speak, like you're mentioning, and then the outer edge of this urban growth boundary. And I believe it's for when master planning efforts and specific zoning districts are actually proposed in those sort of bubbled out areas. And then when they have specific rules in place for some of those properties, then as it seems, as in examples I've seen at least, that when that zoning is adopted and that master planning is adopted, then it's annexed into city limits.
Oh, okay.
That's also with a huge asterisk on it being a county planner and not knowing all the behind the scenes for that. But there's also the Metropolitan Planning Organization is this entity that sort of plans the in-between components, like the Tumalo effort. That's sort of parts of these areas are really very generally described as being a little more urban than the rural sort of farm forest based zoning you see really fully outside of the city jurisdictions. And so even that entity itself is almost something that's a little closer to a management sort of agency that is talking about the exact areas you're looking at there. But I think I think maybe to end it on something that I've also pretty broad is that I believe it's just it's case by case and very growth driven for when those city limits meet that urban growth boundary.
Often have the same question from people in the community, and Commissioner Kelly, I mean, maybe this isn't directly addressing your question, but my understanding is, a UGB line is a 20-year planning window, right? And so theoretically, over the course of that 20 years, as a city annexes parcel by parcel, their city boundary is going to begin to approach to the UGB. And right now we're close to that situation. And so, the city of Bend will undergo a new UGB process, bump it back out, but then it'll be annexed as the city
Little by
boundary
little.
grows to that.
So, and we maybe bring it back to the topic at hand. Is there any other questions related to Title 17? Commissioner
I
Altman.
have a lot of questions. I lost my page. So I had a question on page 27 of 108, so 27 of your memo.
Okay.
The item at the bottom C, where it says for subdivisions or portions thereof proposed within a DCC chapter 18.56 surface mining impact area zone, the applicant shall demonstrate that the subdivision creates lots on which noise or dust sensitive uses can be cited consistent with the requirements of DCC chapter 1856. What does that mean?
That term noise sensitive,
Right.
that's comes out of this a combining zone similar to the landscape management combining zone or wildlife area combining zone. This one's called the surface area impact or surface mining impact area combining zone. And it's a certain radius outside of an actual designated surface mine zone where you can anticipate dust and noise impacts from those surface mining activities. And so what this is trying to do is that when you're even at the platting phase of that, that you're anticipating how to provide abatement essentially for any kind of dwelling, residential development and kind of residential living that would occur on those properties that are close enough to those surface mines to experience those impacts.
And just to add a little bit of value to that, and something that'll be probably come up in our Goal 5 inventory, surprisingly, The Goal 5 inventory protects surface mines from neighbors. So what's happened is in those circumstances, the county has identified a resource, a mineral resource that is of a value to the county. And one of the things that can happen is as people move in around that, they can gain, legal claims to peace and quiet, dust, and avoidance of blasting. And so what'll happen in those lots that are in those areas is that as a precursor to development, that you have to sign an agreement that says, I'm moving in next to a mine. They're going to do mine stuff. If they do, it's my tough luck. And there are some places where there's a presumption that it's not suitable to put a dwelling, and within 250 feet of the mine has the most restrictions associated with it. It requires very careful review. So what you can see here in the subdivision code is, basically a warning: don't be creating lots that in the end you're not going to be able to put a house on. And that's it. That's really what it's getting at there.
That answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
I think so.
You got 6 more?
Probably not. I'm trying to whittle it down.
Only 4.
Like your questions, Susan.
Thank you.
Take your time.
Okay, so on page 34 of 108. Which one is it? Okay, at the top, item B, it says the proposed partition will not conflict with the terms of a previously issued approval for a land use on the property or would otherwise create a non-conforming use on any of the newly described parcels with respect to any existing structure and or use. What would be a conflict there of a previously issued approval?
Sure. So, I mean, generally, for instance, so this is in a section about tentative platting, where you would be submitting a plan for a land division. And so let's say that you're drawing a line through the middle of, or you're reconfiguring lines to now absorb, let's say, another house onto a dwelling or a parcel that already had a dwelling. And so that would foul the single family allowance of this subject parcel, while also in other logistical ways, kind of convoluting the records for this previous property that had on paper a dwelling and all the approvals and permitting for that. But now it's you have a non-conforming double dwelling in this example on one property, and you also have a conflict in that you've convoluted the the permitting history, the record of this other property. That's just one example, but non-conforming generally, just to maybe even bring it back to an example earlier in the night, it was Commissioner Kelly had mentioned these manufactured homes you see that are sometimes ancient, and they might have at some point, maybe long before even land use regulations, been a second or third dwelling that was allowed, but they're no longer under current standards. That's what we would generally call a non-conforming use. So things like that, in this case, the application of this tentative plan section, if it were to be applied in a way that created those either created new conflicts or new conforming uses, this is trying to get in the way of that. It requires essentially some kind of review of the compliance of, all those moving parts should you put forward a plat.
An intuitive example of that, let's say that I had developed back in the 50s a single 20-acre property in the RR10 zone before that zone existed with 2 residences. And those residences were clustered tightly. And I said, hey, I'm in the RR10 zone. I've got 20 acres. I want to make a pair of 10s out of this. And I want to put a property line down the middle between the 2 residences. But that property line would result in both of the residences not complying with setbacks. So, let's say that the residences, this is going to be very tight in this example, but, RR10 requires a 10-foot setback from a property line. And let's say that these 2 houses were 10 feet apart total. If you put a line down between of them, you've now created 2 properties with 5-foot setbacks, which are non-conforming uses. This doesn't obviously seem like the most harmful example. I've run into some ones where, for example, that tried to separate a business from its required parking, and then and then redevelop that so that they didn't have a parking lot. And so it just explains that, hey, that's not going to work.
Okay. Let me just see if I have one. Sorry.
Oh, Commissioner Kelly.
While she's looking, one thing that, and I think this has been brought up before, but that I would really hope that we create hyperlinks in our, because there was multiple times I was like, okay, this definition, it says C statute. And then I was kind of like copying and pasting, and so I know that that's because I think it's been brought up, but I just want to say like that, yes, please.
Yeah, and we've heard to date, that's really complicated, we can't do it. And we asked again and they said, for sure. So,
Great.
so looks like we're gonna be seeing those in the near future. Mhm.
I do have another question, if I may, Chair.
Go ahead.
Okay, on page 63 of 108 under fire hazards. So, considering fire hazard is not magically going away, the general discretionary standard says whenever possible, a minimum of 2 points of access. The clear and objective standard says a minimum of 2 points of access. Is there any thought to just making the general discretion? I mean, let's say you have 100 houses in there. It's like, well, if you can, maybe you should make another road. I feel like, no, you need another road. I mean, I think that this is maybe one instance where general and discretionary is maybe too discretionary.
For sure. And you've stumbled on to not just an interesting part of the code, but an interesting example of a type of thing. And so, if I was waving my magic wand, I agree. There should be two ways out. In some circumstances, it doesn't work. So let's say that I front on, I've got a property, and along the whole frontage, which is to the south of me, road property, I'm going to create a 2-lot partition, 1, 2. What would it meaningfully say to say that there's 2 points of access? When you think of a large subdivision, certainly it makes sense that, if this thing's 100 acres and one of the exits is on fire, there should be a different way to drive out. But the principle at work here, and you're going to see this with some regularity if you dig into this more, is that we tried to not make policy choices where we could avoid it. So in the clear and objective example, we said 2 because whenever possible wasn't clear and objective. So we said just 2. But the question of should we close down the lane where somebody could have a single point of access where through a discretionary process, the hearings officer, the board concluded that was appropriate. And if we did that, we're not precluded from doing that in this process, but then we now have a policy question before the board. So we bring in the fire departments and say, fire departments, this has been something you've been concerned about, dear board, potential developers of subdivisions. A lot of them have, a situation where maybe they don't have 2 legal accesses, or they're trying to work with the BLM to get an access, and that one, might have cultural resources associated with it. So it can get complicated in situations. The board and fire departments have said, yeah, one can work, especially if you have these considerations. So we've had to exercise tremendous discretion, especially on those provisions that have been painful to planners over time, to not try to weigh down this process with policy considerations. And there's so many things in here that if you just gave me a red pen and said, well, get it, I would want to fix. And this is, I think one of them is, it just feels like there should be 2 ways out, or we should explain it better when there should be and when there shouldn't be. So we left it alone at great personal frustration.
So I would offer from a fire perspective that while 2 accesses are always handy, it's extremely common to have long cul-de-sacs. And I would suggest that maybe if 2 accesses aren't possible, that maybe we have a change in the width of the road and minimum turn radiuses on the cul-de-sac that accommodate emergency equipment. So you still have you meet the criteria, or you meet the emergency standards, but you maybe change, kind of an if-then. If you have only 1 access, then this is the different standards for this access.
And Chair Commissioner, that's exactly a lot of the examples I've seen. If they do, and kind of maybe in summary of what Will was saying is that if there was the possibility of having a discretionary scenario, which we thought there of course would be, cul-de-sacs and other different layout configurations, but there's exactly that, where if it is a discretionary path and it's a whenever possible, we only have 1 way in and out kind of a thing, we really do look to agency partners and we look at equipment dimensions and what their width would be, what kind of turnaround facilities they specifically would look for. And really it becomes a conversation between those fire entities and the road department for engineering sort of expertise. But then that's where that that adequate, occupant evacuation comes into
Right.
compliance.
I guess where I was getting at is that even within the clear and objective, you could have an if then. If you can't meet this criteria, can you meet this criteria? And if that's a no, then you fall back to the, okay, let's negotiate a solution.
And that's a great
Just a thought.
example. I certainly don't want to discard that. And at the same time, let me balance this correctly, is that if you've got a solution that you believe that you'd work, like, hey, I think that we can put an if then statement that would make one access appropriate here. We can add that to the process. It's just, we need to make sure there's some additional effort and like, hey, all fire departments, are you okay with this? Are there other considerations? So if this, I want to use this as an example and not a kind of the specific, is if you see something where you're like, hey, I think there is an if then statement, something that's clear and objective that could open up more possibilities here. This is back to the HOV lane. I want more people driving in it, and I don't want to kick somebody out of the HOV lane when there is a solution to this problem. So, if you have specific language that you think would deal with this, we'd be interested. Or you could simply recommend to us, as the Planning Commission. It seems like these particular instances seem like they would benefit from more robust, clear and objective opportunities. Here's a general outline of them. Staff, go get them.
Perfect. Thank you. Do you have any more? You're all done? Thanks. Anybody else have any questions? If not, we'll move on to the next agenda item. Thank you.
Thank you very much, commissioners.
We'll look forward to the hearing.
Yeah, we'll see you in 2 weeks at the hearing. Thank you.
Well,
Well, you're up.
again. Yep. Again, your planning manager, Will Groves. I am joining the Zoom so I can show you a PowerPoint here and share my screen.
My notes say your topic is the work plan.
It is the work plan, and this is let's see if we can get this thing into presentation mode. Let's see, are we seeing, yeah, we're seeing that up there. That's good. And now I want to get this to be enough kind of a full screen. Aha.
I always wondered how you guys get anything done with the time it takes to create these cool slides.
Oh, honestly, nobody looked. This is the 2023 presentation with the dates changed. And, relevant information updated. So if you see the year 2023 in there, I was doing this yesterday. So, hey, this is a preparation for the work plan hearing coming up at your next regularly scheduled meeting. Of course, we do a work plan every year, and this is some background for you as a work session in preparation for that. What is the work plan? It's a review of last year's efforts that's been made by CDD and the Community Development Department, and talking about efforts in the coming fiscal year. And it's designed to allow the Planning Commission and the board to give direction and feedback on the work to be undertaken. Of course, CDD is more than just planning. You see long-range planning, there's current planning as well as coordinated services, our building division, on-site wastewater, code enforcement. So in this report that was attached to your packet, you'll see a summary of all of these departments' work over the year. Of course, there's a timeline associated with this. January through March, we're drafting up the work plan. Here in March that we brought it to you for work session and public hearing, and then it proceeds on to the onto the Historic Landmarks Commission and to the board for hearings and work sessions. Of course, the annual work plan and its current draft is available online at the links shown here. And this, of course, this meeting is to provide you a summary of that work plan, see if you have any questions in preparation for the hearing that you'll be having at your next regularly scheduled meeting, and then we'll conduct that hearing. Some general themes out of the work plan. So we're seeing continued population growth driving demand for services. Of course, legislative updates, lots of exciting new opportunities like ADUs and RVs that are driving not just planning efforts, but building safety and code enforcement issues. Affordable housing continues to be a major theme, and those land use policies are key priorities. Dealing with regulatory and compliance issues, of course, new laws coming out of legislative sessions have been something that we've been working on. Also, we're processing complex land use cases and trying to ensure that those are compliant with evolving state and local regulations. A big part of what we do is community engagement and services. So the planners that our current planners, over 50% of what they do on a daily basis is responding to people with questions who may or may not be coming forward with an application. So just community outreach. And so we're trying to enhance our website and digital services for efficiencies in that regard. As I just hinted at, non-fee generating work is a big part of what we do, and collaborating with partner agencies. Of course, infrastructure, environmental concerns, a major theme, groundwater protection for South County. Thinking about the wildfire maps, of course, we've talked a little bit about that, those may not go forward in the way that they were initially intended, but we're tracking that and ready to respond to how that progresses. And again, thinking a lot about digital tools. So we've been working for the better part of a year trying to get an online comment form so that somebody who wants to comment to us could say, I want to talk about this project and here's a comment on it. It will really help them find the project, the information associated with it, allow that comment to be automatically entered into the record without having to kind of have an email engagement with the planner if somebody prefers that way of engaging. Budget and operational issues. We are a fee supported department, and with the board's direction, we try to keep that building across the way afloat. And we're seeing modest improvement in permit volumes. And it was really driven by ADUs in the past year. So to the extent that we didn't just have the previous year over again, it was ADUs, and they were 4% of our dwelling permits, 20% of the site evaluations for septic, and 5% of our total land use applications. So a real business driver in the past year. Workforce and staffing, of course, as you all know, personnel costs are a significant part of that. And we've got a total of 52 FTE at this point. Just noting that we're in a different spot than we were, I think, one of the previous times I talked to you with. We're seeing increasing veterancy in the department with, almost half of our staff with over 5 years of experience. We were really kind of on the other side of that curve, particularly in planning, and we're really seeing some exciting just integration of people being around for longer periods of time. Also noting that we've got a lot of retirements coming up. 15% of the staff are eligible in the next kind of 3 to 8 years for retirement. And those staff have, many of them have accumulated significant vacation times that they'll either burn off through vacations or, that they're paid out for. And so trying to budget for those opportunities. Thinking a lot about working with HR and how we get and retain good people here with the cost of living. Of course, we talked about the significant challenges of non-fee generating work, research, legislative priorities, they're straining resources, and we're trying to balance that productivity with staffing transitions and economic shifts, always trying to stay nimble for the legislative session. There's every legislative session, new opportunities come out. The board's excited to jump on that. And also, just really, again, an ongoing focus on housing efforts and partnerships that enhance those, and digital delivery of services. So now let's take a look at the annual report for the prior year. So in the past year, we're proud to say that we maintained our high levels of customer service and navigated some staff transitions and remote work. We are increasingly back in the office, so consistent with other county departments, fewer remote days, more in-office days for our staff. And it's funny, I think all of you maybe have experienced this, but there are some people who work best at home and not bothered, and there's some people who really flourish in the office environment, and those quick interactions have a real benefit. And, on the whole, I think as a manager, it's been a bit of a wash for me, having people more and less in the building. Some people just will do an insane amount of work when they're left alone, and other people will, they need those integrations with other people. So a shift. Thinking a lot about online opportunities for people to interact with us, trying to save people the drive time. We're a big county, especially if you're way out east, it's a major drive to come into town. And we're thinking about succession planning and cross-training. Again, a lot of our staff is getting up there towards retirement, and we're trying to make sure that goes as smoothly as possible. You'll see a lot of performance measures. We have aspirations that we've worked with the board for turnarounds. And those are, you can think of this as part of a, kind of a multi-pronged approach of that, if the more that things cost, the more people we have, the faster it gets done. Performance measures look great, but then it's costs the community more. So there's a constant conversation between delivery of service and the cost associated with it. We could, in theory, lower costs significantly, if we just had a hole in the wall over in there and said, stuff your papers through it and we'll tell you if you're wrong. Instead we do really extensive community outreach. And, when somebody calls and says, hey, I'm thinking of doing a thing, we say, come in, sit down with all of us. Let's get you ready for this. We want this to be as achievable as possible. And then we really had to focus on that over time. But you'll see performance measures associated with that. Of course, the planning division, lots of work that you all participated in, including some housekeeping amendments, wildfire hazard building code amendments, the Bend Air Traffic Control Tower amendments, mini storage, of course, engaged with, but ultimately rejected by the board. Got through the transportation system plan update, and we're continuing to work on the 2040 comprehensive plan update. And again, just noting a slight decrease in overall land use applications, but very similar year to year. Work plan. So here we are looking into the future. So we're asking you to review the draft work plan, have a public hearing on the 27th, and as in prior years at the deliberations in April, we'll be asking you to provide recommendations on the relative priorities of those tasks. There's some ongoing commitments that we expect that will continue to be a priority for both the Planning Commission and board, including the comprehensive plan update, as well as the Newberry Country Plan outreach. That's something that's, I would say, is currently on the, if not the front burner, the back burner, the middle burner, trying to keep that moving, and at the same time trying to deal with some other issues that we've discussed, planning priorities. Natural resources and hazards, we talked about a lot of these. Groundwater continues to be a significant effort, and again, matching any sort of state efforts with fire. We have a natural hazards mitigation plan. So the sheriff's office coordinates a broad plan that thinks about everything from high winds to volcanoes, and make sure that we, in particular for winter storms and wildfire, the biggest ones, that we're thinking about those appropriately, something that's required by FEMA. And there's been an interest over time to have code that integrates with those intentions of those plans. Sage grouse, of course, Nicole was before you on our own ongoing cooperation with BLM for that. Dark skies, everybody excited about dark skies. Tanya Salzman's holding that project, and fingers crossed that, when she gets RVs finally across the finish line, that you'll be seeing her in regard to that. Lots of coordination with cities. I recognize this is a big slide. I'm going to hit the highlights, but with the city of Bend working on UGB amendments, park space and urbanization, City of La Pines going through their comprehensive plan process, and the Newberry neighborhood. This is an area that the county initially owned and has now, or the county does own, was in county jurisdiction, has come into the city of La Pine. It was given to us by the feds to generate resources to money specifically to deal with groundwater issues in South County. Long history there, but we own it, and now it's inside the city. So making sure that under city plans can be developed appropriately. City of Redmond, of course, thinking about their comprehensive plan, our joint management agreement with that city, as well as their own clear and objective efforts on lands that we jointly manage. Sisters, of course, going through a UGB expansion process. The board, of course, is always thinking about housing strategies, and so we have a task that we've been wanting to get to think about what occupancy. That's a occupant. Nobody look at the slide. That's a word. Thinking about occupancy. So previously we limited occupancy in dwellings based on familial relations, and under state law, we can't do that anymore. So a little bit worried that our county code currently, if you wanted to have 28 of your ski buddies in a house in Deschutes River Woods, it doesn't really say you can't. And it's going to be real rough on a septic system. So thinking about how, if at all, we want to deal with that. Of course, thinking about rural housing and homelessness, and thinking about Terrebonne and Tumalo a lot. Both of them are aspiring to have kind of sewer systems. It looks like that the current federal budget has maybe cut Terrebonne out of some of that money. So it'll be interesting to see if that's restored at some point. Zoning text amendments, mostly the same ones you all saw from last year. So these are smaller projects that planning has identified over the years. You have seen the boards identified as kind of ongoing things that would be nice to complete. And if you have any questions about any of these specifically, I can go into some detail. Each of these has its own history, but they were all things that if I had 20 long-range planners, we'd knock them all out, and the board would be excited to see a lot of these things completed or at least investigated. I'll pick one as an example. Minor variance from 10% area lot rule for farm and forest, picking that one at random. The county code has a provision that deals with lot line adjustments, and it was put in years ago to avoid using lot line adjustments to create kind of end runs around some of the rules that we have. There have been some really creative efforts on behalf of developers. They're like, if you shift the lines around enough, you could build a house. Let's say you had an 80-acre minimum requirement. You could say, hey, I'm going to build my house on this 80-acre property, and now I'm going to shift 79 of those acres over to adjacent property with a lot line adjustment, and it now has 80 acres. So now I'm going to build my house on this 80 acres property. And in one place in the state, that happened 7 times in a row. So there was a county provision that was trying to tamp down on that. And in more recent years, really in the past decade, state statute in ORS 92-192 has really refined how lot line adjustments can and can't be used, and it's a much more well thought out, nuanced tool. And so there's been an interest on behalf of the community of removing the kind of the antiquated county approach that we have in here for the 10% rule. Again, sounds very esoteric, but in practice, if I'm a farmer and I've got 80 acres and I want to give 40 acres of it to my neighbor because I'm, want to do a little less farming as I get older, that's this rule can complicate those sorts of land transfers. So just something that, it's a neat fix that we'd love to do. And, there's always this question about, we were going to do dark skies, I swear. So got to be careful. And we're specifically asking you for the relative priorities of some of these things. So particularly tonight or in the hearing, if you have a question about any of these, we can definitely discuss them. Of course, citizen and PC comments, you all have shown significant interest in panel discussions. Appreciate the chair's suggestions, and we'll enter that as testimony for your hearing as kind of to help support those discussions. Of course, you heard the citizen input about Deschutes River Woods as an unincorporated community. Mr. Bryant submitted additional written information that'll be before you as part of that hearing packet. Also, the board has been thinking about Goal 11 exceptions for South County groundwater issues. Again, a huge topic. Generally, you're not allowed to extend sewer lines outside of cities in Oregon. There are provisions to do that. The county, together with cooperating partners, looked to do this in the past. And it was concluded by LUBA that we had aspired too boldly in how much land that we had hoped to bring sewer potentially to. And so there's a question if maybe a more modest proposal might survive legal scrutiny for areas that are both relatively densely developed and also experiencing groundwater contamination issues. So it wouldn't surprise me if the board took some interest in that and just bring it.
So real quick on that one, is there any action within the legislative process to expand that exception process or eliminate some of that under Goal 11? Because quite frankly, I think it makes so much more sense to allow small independent sewer systems in rural subdivisions.
Yeah, I think that there's no legislative action currently associated with it, but the no that we got from LUBA suggested that we just asked for too much and that a more modest and focused ask probably could pass muster. There's a variety of issues that come with this. One of them has to do with the fact that the strongest type of exception that you can get is when there's a public health hazard. And you may recall that the people in the affected area were very concerned about having their property labeled as public health hazards. And we thought, well, could we make up a term impending potential public health hazards? And LUBA said, tell me more about that. So trying to balance these development opportunities and concerns that this would unlock development. So one of the concerns that came from kind of objecting parties to this is that the main lots right now that can't be developed have high groundwater. They have high groundwater because many of them are right adjacent to the river and are in wetlands. And so the concern is that provisions like this would mostly unlock riverfront and riparian development in relatively sensitive habitats, as opposed to get people to hook up their kind of existing failing systems to the sewer. And what the balance of that was a concern from opponents to this process. So concerns about both the legal issues and also the practical effects of this. I mean, certainly if I had just bought an ATT system for $35,000 and then found that, the county had a proposal that was going to require me to hook up to a sewer system for $30,000, I might have some significant concerns about this. So it's tricky in existing communities how to get this to work. But, to your point, Chair Cyrus, smaller systems, coalitions of the willing, we certainly, it seems like we'd like to allow that where people could use higher technology systems across multiple properties. And that's what a sewer system is, two houses flushing into the same ultimate wastewater disposal system. So some interest in that. Of course, next steps, we've got a hearing coming up. You'll make a recommendation in the April deliberations, ranking those zoning text amendments from low to high, as well as identifying any other priorities you'd like to see the board engage with. And then onward to the Historic Landmarks Commission and the BOCC. And with that, I'm available for questions.
Great. Any questions? You have one? Go ahead. Thought you were leaning back out of the way.
I have a question on page 3 of your memo.
Okay.
Just under the City of Redmond coordination, the last bullet point says lands through either a goal exception process or legislative equivalent. Is there supposed to be 1 or 2 words before land? Like acquire or sell or?
Let me take a look at that. I know what you're talking about. I'll tell you more about that. You either to access. So what's going on in this case is that the City of Redmond has long been interested in creating a kind of a south interchange. And they're concerned with the traffic. They'd like to bring along the kind of the south part of town, they'd like to bring a number of large lot industrial opportunities on land. And the whispers are always of a data center or a warehouser like Amazon, a major center, distribution center there. Those things have to be, as I understand it, largely shovel ready. That the developers of those things aren't looking for long-term planning processes. And it's Redmond's understanding that many of these things are constrained significantly by traffic impacts and specifically trying to put large kind of trucking traffic out into the city of Redmond. And so they're hoping to dodge the city of Redmond with a south connection. The difficulty that's come up there is that all of those connections are on farmland or impact farmland, and that prior efforts to that have produced have not passed muster with state law. And so we are partners in a 2-prong approach, which is the, thank you, Nicole, with the save here. It looks like in the memo, there's a repeat there. So you see that lands through either a goal exception or legislative equivalent is just a repeat from the prior section. That's me, copy paste error. I explained a lot to get around to copy paste error.
Okay, any other questions? Oh, Commissioner Hofkamp.
Is it okay to go ahead?
Hmm?
Is it okay to go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh.
They're,
Thank you.
they're conferring.
Yeah. That's good.
Thank you.
Will, just a question for you. I always like looking at work plan for the coming year. Thanks for the opportunity again this year. My question is the same I probably have asked in the past, which is, how can we most productively provide input, or what's the kind of input you're looking for? And I recall, as is referenced here in the staff report, that it's been the practice to sort of present us with matrices or to delineate items in the work plan that are, priority, discretionary, non-discretionary, operational coordination responsibilities that are kind of baked in. Nice to have that information and know how, because it provides context in the overall work plan. But then there's this other category of things that are discretionary and not high priority, where our feedback maybe our observations and so forth maybe is more productive. So if we had some kind of guidance along those lines, if that's the plan, and then I don't know, just sort of general thoughts. You're very kind. All staff is very careful about not being overly prescriptive to commissioners, but just where we would provide the most productive help in regards to that category.
Well, as our citizen involvement body, you're a proxy for kind of the citizens of Deschutes County who I think, we don't see a lot of engagement in the work plan. And it's something that, I think that would benefit from engagement and, very much why we have you here. And so, in years and years ago, we gave you a form and said, fill out these 12 projects, put them in rank order and let us know, and we'll carry that to the board. In more recent years, we've moved towards, and I think in a way that's been very helpful, towards you identifying what's important to you. So, it's like, hey, 4 of you really want to see dark skies. It wasn't on the list, but we wanted to see panels, and that, and that falls, in a similar level of priority or below kind of dark skies. I'm using some specific examples to ground this. And we would carry that forward to the board. The planning commission looked at this, they said to number 7, to this thing, they said, actually, absolutely not. We don't want to see that done with something that you could tell us. And it may be that, some of you, we last year we brought, several commissioners said X, a few commissioners said Y, one commissioner said Z, just to let them know kind of as you as a proxy for the citizens, what was interesting to you on those discretionary processes. I mean, if, certainly you could advocate that we stop talking to the city of Redmond, but some of these things are unlikely to be taken off the menu. Those things kind of, as we get further in the report, there are things that, are more interesting, and your continuing interest in dark skies has kept that, if not, it's just always off the horizon. It's always the next thing we're going to do. And then, something comes out of the legislature, or we lose a case and we realize our code's broken and, stuff cuts the line. So one of the things you could say is hey, really, we want to see dark skies delivered this year. And we recognize that may compete with other priorities. It's important to us. We know it's been on the list. We want to really, really push for it this year. And, as you've heard, the board's in favor of it as well. So I think just a little bit of what's interesting to you, both individually and as a group, and we carry that forward to the board and let them know what your priorities are. And there may be things that aren't on here. So it may be things like, there had been some interest in kind of self-service farm stands. We talked about this years ago, and it's on the kind of the to-do list there, which is, if somebody wanted to have a sort of an unmanned buy some eggs, leave $5 station, on the front of their property, could we facilitate that? And yeah, there could be rules to do that. And it's always sat kind of below the threshold of exciting things like ADUs and RVs and mandates from the state, for fire requirements and things like that. But it definitely helps us understand your relative priorities about this. And there might be new opportunities. You might be like, hey, I was talking to my neighbor and they're having a particular problem with county code. Is it possible that we fix this? Again, we're always looking for those opportunities, and where we hear them from citizens, you'll see them sneak into these lists over the years, and where we hear them from you, we'll carry those forward to the board.
Okay, well, fair enough. And I guess I just asked the same question to my colleagues. Matt, you and I have been through this a couple of times, number of times. Susan, you've been
Once or twice, yeah.
more, even more. Is it a satisfactory process to provide input and evaluate the work plan? Going forward, having, some idea of things that really they have to be there, ongoing coordination kind of things, high priority items, but then a number of items that we can kind of look at and provide input. And then as Will's just open the door, I think, Matt, you've been good about adding, some additional thoughts and stuff like that. Does that work?
Yeah, I would certainly encourage everybody, if you've got anything, or back in people in your community. I was, when we advertise a hearing on this, I was certainly going to encourage the community that I represent to, show up and make any suggestions that they think are important that they'd like to see us address. So I guess I would encourage everybody to, submit any ideas, comments to Will, and encourage other people to do the same.
And I didn't mean to exclude. I should have included Commissioners Williams and Kieras too that are with us. Just have you been satisfied with that process in the past? Thinking about sort of items that again are kind of baked in, and then those where we have some input or.
Yeah, Commissioner Williams.
Yes, I think year to year, even though we're looking at the same priorities, I think the order might change, and that has anything to do with, could it be we had a great snow year? Did we not have a great snow year? How many permits have been applied for? But I think it's definitely worth our input. And Chair Cyrus, when you said submitting, my question would be, should we submit our priorities, low to high, high to low, whatever, as the asides to Will, or should we bring them up after the public hearing? That would be my question, because you engage with different people along the way every day and always get different feedback. And just myself, meeting with a women's club group recently, got exposed to some older ideas, but they're still very important and have kind of been in the background. So I do believe it's good that we provide our input. It's just, how do we want that input provided for this specific topic?
Well, I will ask Will to correct me if I'm wrong, but my suggestion would be that you submit ideas to Will, and then the public hearing, all of those will be incorporated into what's thrown out as far as comments to be discussed at the public hearing. And then when we do our deliberations, then we can ultimately decide what rank order and what importance we want to put on all of those that have been brought forth. Does that sound about right?
That sounds great. And I think that that's helpful in that, I think the default would be that, we come to deliberations and that, that you're making suggestions, but to the extent that they're there at the hearing, that allows the citizens to really engage. You might have something that's, you're like, hey, I have an idea, and someone comes up and says, yes, and here's some, other stuff you need to know about that. And that'd be great to happen while the record's open. So to the extent that you send me information, I'll include it in the record. And that can be before both kind of the public and your fellow commissioners as we think about opportunities going forward.
Yeah, for example, after our discussion about panels previously, I went ahead and submitted something officially to Will to be entered into the record to get them on as an agenda item and part of the overall topic. So anything you might have, I'd say by all means, submit them to Will, and then he can add them to the list, and then they'll be open for both public discussion and ultimately for deliberations downstream. Any other questions?
Got one other question,
Go ahead,
comment.
Commissioner?
Yeah, comparing 2023 annual plan, 2024, looking at the code enforcement, I liked seeing that we went from, in 2023, it was 721 new cases and 490 were resolved. To in 2024, it went from 651 new cases and 563. So it was a lot more resolved. Gave reasonings. Kind of just want to pick your brain. Is there anything that stands out to you for why more code enforcement was resolved? Because it gives a lot more hope in community to file code enforcement when they see that higher percentage being resolved. So I was just curious for your perspective on that.
It'd be interesting to ask Peter this. This is, of course, I manage one division, and he's the director of all of them, and he'll have some perspectives. But from what I understand, there's a number of factors. One is a really significant effort to rework code enforcement. I think that they had been, I think you've all been on part of kind of crews who are maybe not working as efficiently as you might because you're just working under your last kind of good orders as frantically as you can. And there have been some real efforts in recent years to kind of think systematically about how can we use modern electronic tools, some of the databases that we have to improve efficiency. We've had some luck, although we've had staff transitions, we've had some good hires. And also there's a little bit of there's kind of a code enforcement ebb and flow that has a little bit to do with development. Mm-hmm. That, as lots of people are moving in, they come to an area and they both change that area and can be frustrated with the way the area works. And so in times of kind of less, you'll see surges of complaints, and other times where people are, they've kind of, to the extent something might not be ideal in their community, they've decided that they're willing to tolerate it. So a little bit of all of these factors in play, but the one I think we're most proud of is really a significant work. I remember looking at Peter's whiteboard, and he had a giant flow chart of all the kind of how we take complaints in and how they how they get dealt with. A major change that that we've made recently is that we're notifying property owners earlier on that there's been a complaint against their property. So what in the past, what we would do is if we'd received a complaint, we would basically hold that in our back pocket till we had some reason to believe that it was accurate. And we would move that sort of later in the process to deal with that. Recently, what we've realized is that, if somebody's buying a property and there's a code enforcement complaint and it has an unresolved status, so there's a cranky neighbor, but nobody's checked out what's going on, that creates a public difficulty. And so we're moving to use our law enforcement resources to basically do property drive-bys. So if you complain, hey, there's 10 RVs on my neighbor's property, we would be there'd be a piece of paper sitting hidden from the public that says there may be a problem with this property. And so we're moving to try and at least initially verify those and daylight them earlier so that potential buyers would be aware of it, as well as landowners being aware that there may be some controversy associated with their property. And really grateful for the law enforcement resources that are afforded to us to do those drive-bys as a quick assessment of, does there seem to be any merits to this case as best we can tell. So seeing some of those efficiencies in the system.
That's great. Thanks for the update.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Comments? Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
With that, go into comments. Do you have any other comments?
No, just thanks for a great meeting. Appreciate all the questions that you're asking. Really good ones. Appreciate your patience digging into these extensive materials. Lots of pages of documents, and to the extent that, as you prepare for the hearing, I think the most interesting section in the Title 17 clear and objective sections is that you'll see there's now I think it's 1716-101 and another section that's got something like a .101. These are the new clear and objective sections associated with partitions and subdivisions. And you'll see staff made some significant effort in those points to define what orderly development looked like. And you'll see a lot of referrals to experts. We're really trying to make it so that, something that was previously the discretion of the road department, the discretion of planners, public process to say, look, if you do X, Y, and Z, your subdivision, it's good. And frankly, we made it up. So your attention to that and seeing if to the extent as you think about it, those provisions in the .101 sections are ones where we did, I think, the most creative work trying to imagine what it would be like to say, okay, every time if you come in and you do X, Y, and Z, this subdivision is good. And trying to not make it too rigorous so that nobody uses it, and trying to make it rigorous enough so that it doesn't leave real flooding, fire, other suitability hazards out there.
Right. And I understand the comp plan came back.
Yeah, comp plan came back. Yay. Sort of. So of course, the comprehensive plan, was appealed to LUBA, and the Central Oregon Land Watch was an appellant to that. They had a notice of intent to appeal and provided a brief describing the issues that they thought the county had not done appropriately. And many of these related to the way we approach the comprehensive plan. So as a document, so we, in an effort to minimize kind of the eye-crossing number of edits that were undertaken, we said we're flushing the whole comprehensive plan and making a new one. And so it's a clean document. Here you go. And something that was not brought to our attention and is a matter of state law is that when you do that, it basically unmoors all the case law that you've done on the years for all the language that you didn't change. So we, in response to this, we have withdrawn the comprehensive plan to bring back and engage in poor Nicole, a significant administrative effort to make a red line, underline, cross out version of the code. So for example, there may be parts of the code that were completely unchanged. The policies were the same before and after, but because, hi, Nicole. You want to jump in here? She's our expert on this.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify, because when we've explained this to some folks, there's been a little bit of confusion. So one of the, allowances that you have in the LUBA process, if you feel that something hasn't been resolved during the local government hearing process, you can essentially keep the appeal going, but you do what's called a withdrawal, where you're able to essentially have a reconsideration hearing. So in this case, what Will was mentioning, we didn't mean to essentially remove these pre-existing policies. And in fact, we made a few like kind of clarifying tweaks, but for, I would say, 15 of them, and they're all related to rezoning. The ones related to rezoning of farm and forest land to non-resource lands, the others for rural industrial rezonings. Essentially, we didn't intend to just repeal and replace those. We meant to carry them forward. So through this reconsideration hearing, we can say, hey, thanks for expressing your concerns in the petitioner's brief. Let's, enter in new information into the record, try to settle this at the local hearing. If the petitioner, Landwatch, is satisfied with the outcome of that hearing of kind of, adding in that clarity that we weren't intending this to be, full repeal and replace, that we are showing our homework with the red lines, then potentially the appeal could end there, or they could update their notice of intent to appeal, and then we'd keep that LUPA appeal going. So we did this one other time in 2017 or 2019 rather, related to the marijuana text amendments that we had. So we have done it before. But yeah, I would say, just so that we are on a very strict timeline from LUBA. So typically you only go back to the last hearings body. We'll have a hearing before the Board of County Commissioners, limited de novo only on this topic. So it won't be coming back to you for a public hearing or deliberations. It'll be at the board. But if you've provided any public comments as a, kind of member of the public, you will get notice of that public hearing. So I'm working on those red lines now, as Will mentioned, and we have to do that for essentially the entirety of the document. So it is taking a little bit of time, but we're hoping to finish that hopefully by next week, and then ideally schedule the board hearing sometime in April. So we'll keep you updated on that. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and that concludes my comments, and thanks, Nicole. Excellent
So-
summary.
Nicole, did you have any comments?
That's it.
Derek? Or Tara, excuse me, sorry. Legal counsel, anything?
Yeah, just everything that Will sharing, especially Will and Nicole both of you in the comprehensive plan. I've been busy behind the scenes, helping work through some of these issues, not only on the comp plan, but some of the minimum lot size stuff that Will was mentioning a few minutes ago. It's a pleasure to work with staff, and it's great to see you all here. Taking the time to help.
Right. Thank you. Commissioner Williams?
No comments. Look forward to seeing you guys in a couple of weeks.
All right, Commissioner Karas?
Same. See you in a few weeks. Thanks for bearing with me over here on the Zoom.
Hey, thanks for dialing in. Commissioner Hopkamp?
Just in regards to dark skies, supposed to have a total lunar eclipse tonight. If the sky's clear,
moon, I
get out, see that. Yeah, that's all.
Great, thanks. Commissioner Kelly? Okay. Vice Chair?
No comment.
Commissioner
No
Hopkamp?
comment.
Or, Mark?
And
Yeah.
camp.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, and I don't have anything other than thanks everybody for a good, efficient meeting, and we got a lot done, and thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
That's very
Uh,
long meeting.